It is my pleasure to introduce to you David Tom, President of the IBI Group.
Thank you, Mark. I am delighted to be here. As Mark said, I'm the president of IBI Group, and we are very proud to be a sustaining partner of the First Nations Major Projects Coalition. And I'm delighted to be here to provide some introductory comments to this really important mini series. I've been with IBI since we started the firm, and that's been a 47-year journey for me. And we've recently joined the Arcadis group, which is why you see Arcadis on my tagline there. And that is, they are, among other things, a global leader in environmental sciences, research, and engineering. And I'm excited because it gives my firm and my colleagues, I think we're better positioned to engage in one of the most pressing challenges that we face, which is kind of characterized by what this conversation is all about: the road to net zero. This is a series that builds upon a really significant conference held in Vancouver in April of this past year, and I was delighted to be part of that. One of the things that came out of that conference and was introduced was the primer on that was sent out in advance of the conference, and it was Indigenous leadership and opportunities in the net zero transition. Mark, of course, one of the co-authors of that, is chairing the panel today. And for any of you who have not read that document, and I assume many of you would have seen that, it is one of the most comprehensive documents that I've seen about this topic of leading to net zero. It is well researched and really well presented. It's extremely informative. There's a lot in there, and I would just encourage everybody in this conference to read that document. There's a great panel today, and JP, good to see you again. And I know that it's going to be an exciting conversation. Before we got cut off on the pre-conference, there was a lot of bit of back and forth conversation going on, and just from the start of it, I was learning new things just in the initial banter of the pre-conference discussion earlier this morning. So I know it's going to be an informative conversation. I'm looking forward to it. I know I'm going to learn a lot from this. This is a road that I think we all want to be on. I think we all acknowledge that that road, that the only road, as this conference says, to net zero runs through Indigenous lands. That's a really significant. That's an important and meaningful statement. I believe it to be true. And I'm looking forward to hearing a lot more about that. So, Mark, I'll turn it back to you, and thank you for having me on and to do this introduction.
Thank you, Tom. And we very much appreciate IBI's sponsorship and support of the work that we are doing at the Coalition. So good day, everyone. My name is Mark Podlasley. My ancestral name is Tatsha, and I'm a member of the Ntlaka'pam First Nation in South Central British Columbia and the Pacific Northwest of the United States. I am the Chief Sustainability Officer at FNMPC, and I'm a Board Director at Hydro One and an Adjunct Professor at the UBC Sauder School of Business. I am speaking to you today from the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. The Toward Net Zero by 2050 conference, which you just heard Tom speak of, was hosted by the First Nations Major Projects Coalition here in Canada and the First Peoples Worldwide group out of the United States. We hosted the conference in April in Vancouver, Canada, and at the conference, ideas were presented that laid new ground on what Indigenous nations, industry sectors, and governments can do to achieve the solution and vision, the new reality in which Indigenous nations own and are presented with the opportunity to own equity in net zero focused energy and climate solution infrastructure projects. Yet, the questions remain for projects proponents and capital providers and Indigenous communities. How do all parties identify, define, and incorporate Indigenous values in a major project? Issues of capital access, regulatory hurdles, deal structures, Indigenous commercial governance, shared traditional territory, and multiple Indigenous communities must all be taken into consideration. Today, I am honored to be joined by guest speakers Kate Finn, Executive Director, First Peoples Worldwide, JP Gladue, Principal of Makwata, and Scott Smith, Partner, Gowlings WLG. We will do a quick post-conference recap and highlight trending net zero investment models, Indigenous equity ownership as it relates to energy generation on critical mineral projects, and lessons learned in developing policies that support a just and prosperous energy transition for all of us. But before I begin, I would like to thank FNMPC sustaining partners, Synovus, CIBC, Colliers Project Leaders, Cowie, Gowling WLG, IGI Group, New Gold, and Patent Energy for supporting today's discussion. With that, I'd like to turn it to our panelists. All of the panelists you see today on the screen were deeply involved in the conference that we held in Vancouver of April this year, which focused on net zero by 2050. Over 1,300 individuals came, Indigenous, non-Indigenous, government, and industry, to discuss how we will, as a collective society, reach net zero targets by 2050. And how will we do that when a majority of the critical minerals and the electric generation that is required to meet those targets will come from or cross or impact Indigenous lands. The conference itself was a hotbed of discussion where people could ask questions to industry, to Indigenous parties, and to government about how do we get to a net zero future without destroying the present in terms of land access, in terms of legal questions, in terms of capital attraction. So I'm just going to ask each of our panelists to give us a quick recap of what their impressions from the conference, from the time that they spent coordinating the discussions in their own panels, but also feedback post-conference. So I'll start with you, Kate. You were our honored guest and partner this year at the conference in Vancouver. We'd be very interested to hear what your take has been after the conference.
Yes, well, thank you so much, and it's great to see you all this morning. I'm so honored to be a continued part of this conversation with First Nations Major Project Coalition, and to see you both, JP and Scott and Mark, on the screen as well. Like Mark said, we were honored to co-present the conference last year in April on what it means to have Indigenous leadership in net zero, and really it was a phenomenal conversation and the beginning of a phenomenal conversation about the ways that Indigenous peoples are already leading, the ways that Indigenous peoples are building deals that actually take them into future generations, the way that a long-term view of 7 generations forward is really what deal making needs to be just for Indigenous peoples, but it's something that the world can learn, and it's something that we can bring as a unique value set into the private sector as Indigenous leaders. So the conference to me was such a wonderful way to center and showcase Indigenous leaders throughout North America and the way to do that. And I loved the words of Vanessa Roanhorst from Native Women Lead when she was talking about how we center ESG as Indigenous peoples, and we always have. And there's a real way to bring that into the conversation, bring that into the discourse, and to do that. And it was such a great conference in terms of starting that discourse, elevating that discourse. Mark, you and I had so many conversations around what that means, and everybody that was at the table. And I'm really looking forward to this next conference to talk about the how. How do we do this? When do we do this? How can we do it? Why can we do it? And all of the rest. And so, it's really an honor to be a continued part of this conversation and to start start threading through these things. And I'll just make a brief comment. I had the honor to sit on a panel of Indigenous women in sustainable finance and to lead that conversation and to really have the opportunity to elevate so much expertise from women from Indigenous nations all over North America. And what I'm looking forward to in this next conference in April is figuring out, okay, how do we build more of that? How do we build a waterway for Indigenous leadership in the private sector? How do we build a waterway for Indigenous women's leadership in the private sector? How do we make sure that the expertise, the decision-making power, and the values that we carry as Indigenous peoples really do become a part of private sector decision-making? And to that, I'll say, since the conference in April, there was a report done a couple months ago by Mark Trahant from Indian Country Today. And what he found is that of the 4,000 companies that are traded on Wall Street, either through the New York Stock Exchange or through the NASDAQ, the number of American Indian or Alaskan Native people serving on corporate boards was less than 1/10 of 1%. So that's where we are right now. And it is an unfortunate standard, but this is what I have to say about this. And I think this is what our conference showed last year and where our conference is leading. Women's leadership, Indigenous leadership is present. So how do we create those waterways? How do we make sure that the private sector is able to support Indigenous leadership on boards, support Indigenous leadership and Indigenous women on boards, in particular in the United States, where this continues to be incredibly concerning. But I will say there's so much hope I have on my end. There's been a lot of tribal elections over the last couple months, and I know for certain that the Tulalip tribe is now formally governed by all women for the first time in history. Of course, women's governance in informal ways has always been present, but the leadership is there. It's there on the tribal side. It's there in Congress. It's there in so many ways. And I'm so excited to continue the conversation about how to build those waterways with you all next April.
Thank you, Kate. And you were right, the session that you led was very powerful. And I'd just like to point out that all of the materials that you were discussing now, the post-conference report as well as the pre-conference reader are available online at www.fnmpc.ca/resources. You can also find references and copies of the recorded copies, of the conferences that Kate has referred to. We were very honored at the conference to be able to present this session or this April event as a all North American event because all of North America involves Indigenous peoples. This is Turtle Island, and we are not separated by the political divisions that sometimes have been imposed colonially on our nations and our lands. So thank you. Again, I would reference fnmpc.ca/resources for those reports. I would also like to remind everybody that we are taking questions. I have so many questions and I was at the conference, that I'd like to bring up. Go to the slido.com and enter FNMPC for questions, and we'll be taking questions after you've heard from our panelists. Next, I'd like to turn to JP Gladue, who is a very good friend and has been involved with the conference and the entire coalition for a number of years. He is very well known in Canada for his leadership in corporate Indigenous questions and board directions. So JP, you were at the conference. What were your thoughts following the event?
Well, thanks, Mark. And again, just to echo, it's great to see you, Kate, even though one-dimensional at this time, and Scott. Just going back, just seeing the evolution of this organization. I remember one of the first meetings that I was at, and meeting Nilo and Chief Shar. That was, I don't even know how many years ago. That's when I was heading up the CCAB. And I think there was only about 20 Twitter followers at the time. And now just to see the organization proliferate the way it has into this space that is absolutely fundamentally integral to the growth of our country and our people. And to see and to be a part of the second conference. the team had me as the media sponsor, or sorry, the media host. So I got to be in the back rooms quite a bit, actually, speaking to folks pre and post panels. As well as managing a panel. When Kate was on there, we had Jason Rysovich, Alicia Dubois, and of course, we were just talking about Vanessa Roanhorse about the intersection of Indigenous values and sustainable finance. And it was a really great panel, and just picking up on some of the flavor, some of the sentiment that Kate was bringing forward. I remember what stuck out for me is that, and it sort of intersects with Kate's panel, was the importance of not only having Indigenous people, but having Indigenous women at the table. And, we know this. I think when we talked about kind of the stats and making sure that women and whenever women are in these areas of leadership, corporations do better. Their numbers are better. Our women are fire keepers. So we know these are the strengths of our projects, of our businesses. So the question I would often ask is, well, what's getting in our way to do more of that? And this conference has brought back to having the opportunity to interview people behind the scenes. Everybody, Minister Wilkinson as an example, everybody's so incredibly supportive of not only FNMPC, the organization itself, but the ideas that the organization and its partners are bringing forward to advance major projects in this country, and of course drawing a lot from our American cousins. And everybody that I spoke to behind the scenes, I couldn't imagine a better time in history for an organization like FNMPC to be at the forefront of these conversations. Again, on the governance, Kate, those are just abysmal numbers. 0.1% of Native Americans that are on corporate boards. Mark, you're on the Hydro One board with Shri, which is amazing. There's 2 Indigenous people on a great board like that. I sit on the board of Suncor. We got Sean Whaley, Telus, Keith Martell. Anyways, we've got some incredible Indigenous leaders. But again, our numbers, even though a little stronger on a ratio basis than our friends in the States, are still far behind where they need to be. I think our numbers are still under 10 people in the single digits of Indigenous people on publicly traded boards. So that's got to change. And why does that have to change? Because when we think about, and this is what we're seeing. I mean, even with that Enbridge announcement last week with the 23 First Nations and the equity that was brought to the forefront in partnerships with province and the communities and the company, having Indigenous people at the forefront, and you're hearing this all the time, is absolutely fundamental. And I know we're going to get into some conversations here, but I'd really like to spend some time after we hear from our good friend Scott about the importance of the value systems and the importance of what defines an Indigenous shareholder as part of an Indigenous corporation versus one of a corporate organization that has shareholders that can be anybody from around the world that are looking for returns. The returns are very different. The timelines are very different. So we'll get into that a little bit. But it was an absolute success, and I'm looking forward to the coming on in April.
Thank you, JP. And you are right. There are a number of us in Canada as Indigenous people who have assumed board leadership positions. The coalition did some research on this in the previous conference on ESG. We found that in Canada there were exactly 7 Indigenous directors, which came out to 0.04% of the publicly traded company directors in this country. So we're not much better than the United States. That's improved since, and our best estimate now is that there are 10, which will put us at 0.042%. So there's a long way to go in terms of reaching an equitable balance in terms of how companies are governed and how Indigenous values then are included and are a competitive advantage for companies looking to work in Indigenous lands in Canada and the United States. So thank you. I'd like to turn now to Scott, who is going to present his thoughts, as you heard from JP, speaking about the questions around legal and values and how those are incorporated and can be incorporated into corporate Indigenous business decisions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark. And it's a real honor and a privilege to be on the panel here with Kate and JP and yourself. Really good to catch up after the conference. I thought it was quite an amazing conference, perfectly timed, coming out of COVID, and I think people were very excited to get together, but in particular to get together and talk about moving towards a net zero economy and what that looked like. And I implore those of you that haven't had the opportunity to look at the post-conference report. There's a lot of wealth in there. I think it really did a great job of capturing some of the themes that emerged from the conference. And I'd like to pick up in my remarks this morning on 3 of those themes and maybe talk about a 4th theme that we didn't hear much about last conference that I'm hoping Mark will be able to get into in this coming conference in April. And I think many of the themes in the report and that came out in the conference speak very much to an issue that Kate raised in her opening remarks, and how do we do this? And I thought the conference provided the attendees with a real roadmap on how we can ensure Indigenous inclusion in a net zero economy. And so I'd like to speak to 3 of these themes that I think emerged from the conference and were captured in the report. The first theme relates to what JP mentioned a moment ago, and it is that an Indigenous values-driven economy is the key to achieving net zero 2050 targets in an equitable and sustainable way. And what does this mean? From my perspective, it means that Indigenous values can and will help inform the type of major projects that we pursue, how we pursue those projects, and perhaps those projects that we decide not to pursue. And I think it's essential in what we heard at the conference that those Indigenous values be incorporated from the onset of project development. One of the things we didn't hear a lot about at the conference, and I'm hoping will emerge in the post-conference discussion leading into our next conference, is how these Indigenous values need to be applied to existing projects. We heard a lot at the conference about new projects, new mining projects, including to access critical minerals as part of the move towards a net zero economy. But we currently have in Canada and elsewhere internationally a number of renewable energy generation projects, mainly hydro projects, that were built decades ago, 30, 40, 50 years ago, that are currently being operated without taking into consideration Indigenous values. And I'm hoping the conversation that happened at the conference and the conversation that we're going to carry forward into the next conference will help people understand what corporations need to do to ensure that existing projects align with Indigenous values. So clearly Indigenous values driving new project development, Mark, and others, I think, is one of the key themes that emerged from the conference. The second theme that I'd like to talk about is one of my favorites: partnerships, partnerships, partnerships. So it was clear from, I think, everybody's perspective, and this perspective has changed over the last 4 or 5 years, that partnering with Indigenous communities is part of the essential ingredients to achieving net zero by 2050. There were 2 quotes in my mind that stood out from the conference, Mark, JP, and Kate. One of them we've heard already, which is the only road to net zero runs through Indigenous lands. The other, Mark, was a quote from you, which was partner or perish, which I really loved. And when we were gathered together in Vancouver during last year's conference, we heard a lot about what are the key principles for partnering with Indigenous communities. And this really speaks to Kate's question about how do we do this? Informed decision-making and relation to free, prior, and informed consent and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Co-development. So gone are the days of Indigenous people being consulted about other people's projects. Indigenous people need to be proponents or co-proponents of major projects moving forward. And on my panel, we heard about how that model of co-development can help deal with some of the regulatory hurdles or red tape that Mark mentioned in his opening remarks. Equity ownership, the third key principle. A number of announcements post-conference, one in particular that I'd like to highlight, Mark, that I think is probably close near and dear to your heart is the Hydro One announcement in Ontario, that Hydro One will now provide 50% equity ownership in all new transmission lines in Ontario. This is what true partnership involves. It involves First Nations and more generally Indigenous people becoming equity owners of projects, and not necessarily just minority owners. 50% owners. What a high watermark. And I'm sure people here in British Columbia and across North America took note of that major announcement. The fourth principle that we heard about is relationships. And for me, relationships are the foundation to partnering with Indigenous people and suggest a very new way of doing business in Indigenous territories. And I'm sure we'll hear more about that leading into the conference next year. The third theme that I'd like to pick up on is what are the steps needed to level the playing field? So a number of conference speakers, the keynote speakers, and just people generally around the conference floor talked a lot about what is required in order to ensure that Indigenous people can take their rightful place in the economy. The post-conference report talks about the two major challenges, climate change and the need to get to net zero, and the historical legacy of colonialism and the need to move forward with economic reconciliation. And one of the themes that emerged, at least from my perspective during the conference, is the need for government support of First Nations to achieve equity ownership in major projects. And for those of you that haven't read it, I would commend that you have a look at an FNMPC resource that's available on the website entitled National Roundtable on Indigenous Access to Capital Primer. So right now in Canada, led by the federal government and NRCan, there's an ongoing discussion with Indigenous people about what's required to achieve access to affordable capital. And there are a number of key suggestions that emanate from that primer. I'd like to highlight three of them: an Indigenous infrastructure bank, loan guarantees. This is something that at the Coalition we've been working hard on a number of years, and access to capacity to ensure that Indigenous communities have the proper resources to engage and develop on their own major projects. And a number of the announcements that we've seen since the conference, including the announcements out of Alberta that JP mentioned, were facilitated by government loan guarantees and other financial mechanisms. Unfortunately, what we're seeing in Canada right now is differing approaches across the provinces and the federal government, and really a need to align best practices to ensure access to affordable capital for Indigenous peoples so that we can see those partnerships and equity ownership of major projects emerge. The fourth theme, and I'm going to stop here, Mark, that I'd like to talk a little bit about is the emergence of Indigenous laws and their application to major projects as part of the Indigenous values that are informing moving towards a net zero economy. And so a number of the major projects that I'm involved in, Indigenous laws or Indigenous peoples are reassuming their jurisdiction over natural resources, passing things like Indigenous water laws that mining companies are now agreeing to comply with as part of obtaining free, prior, and informed consent. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that across Canada, and the reemergence of Indigenous legal orders now helping inform the Indigenous values of moving forward to net zero. So I'll leave it there, and I'm very much looking forward to our discussion with the panel this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. So I'm going to remind viewers, slido.com. Please go there and enter the passcode FMNPC for questions. There's a lot of questions that we're going to be discussing right now, but if you have more, please send them along. The thing that Scott, you raised quite effectively is about this equity question, about 50% being a bar for true partnership. I'd just like to point out that these questions of equity are not Indigenous people asking for grants or giveaways of ownership of these projects. These are projects where Indigenous people will raise their capital and be co-investors in projects. Those projects right now that we were talking about are in relation to energy and minerals related to the net zero transition. And you heard a number from Scott already. There's examples of these happening, how companies have realized that becoming partners with Indigenous people is not only good business, it's a strategic advantage to get to market, to be able to attract capital for investment. And on our materials on the Coalition website, that's very much where we're going. One thing, Scott, that you raised here in terms of other projects in Canada that have been, companies anyway, are starting to move towards engaging on Indigenous people, especially around FPIC, Free, Prior, and Informed Consent, which is part of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. I want to speak a bit about how finance groups are moving towards that, financing and investment groups. But in our pre-discussion here, Kate, you had mentioned developments in the United States where this has become an issue, where it's become the front leading companies are starting to move in this direction. Could you speak a bit about that for our audience?
Absolutely. You know, it's always so fun to be able to speak with you all and to connect knowledge and connect what's going on in our ecosystems here. And I love what Scott said, you know, that FPIC, Free, Prior, and Informed Consent, really is true partnership. It really is relationship. And so much of what we do at First Peoples Worldwide is say exactly that FPIC is the way to create a better relationship. And that includes equity and participation, equity and decision making. It also includes this theme of iteration. Just to mark again what Scott was saying, you know, where there are projects that are already operating that need to be reevaluated, re-understood, and understood in a framework of free, prior, and informed consent, there's an opportunity there. And I think that that is the how. FPIC is so much of the how in terms of driving good relationship, right relationship, just relationship, and responsible relationship. And as you just said, Mark, you know, we have seen that FPIC is a good business decision in so many ways. It's a great way for businesses to understand the totality of their impact and the totality of their risk associated with any project that takes place on Indigenous lands, territories, and with Indigenous resources. And so we see FPIC, we've watched, I think many of us for many years, as FPIC comes and goes in the market and where private sector is going. But we were really thrilled to see in the last couple months in the US on the regulatory side, there's been a lot of work to update the 1872 mining law, and that is how long ago that law was passed. And there's been a lot of work to update that, knowing that there's going to be an incredible increase of domestic mining, given the need for critical minerals. And we were pleased to see that the Chief Policy Officer of Rivian, which is a leading electric vehicle manufacturer, testified to Congress and said, you know, we know that most critical minerals will be mined within 35 miles of Indigenous territories. And so tribal consultation in the form of free, prior, and informed consent must be central to any update in domestic mining laws, end quote. So to see a leading EV manufacturer lobby for and advocate for free, prior, and informed consent, not consultation, not anything less, but that standard of free, prior, and informed consent really shows us where the market is going. It's really a market indicator to us that FPIC is not just a good idea. It really is the leading way to partner well, and it is the leading way to understand how we all move together into net zero. So that's been a really fun development to watch, and we'll continue to watch that as we move forward in the US. And I'll just say on the flip side of that, recently in South Africa, Shell's license to explore was revoked for lack of Indigenous consent. So FPIC is no longer just a good idea or a really good thing to pay attention to. It's in fact material. It's material to corporate operations. It's material to true partnership. It's material to any way that companies want to work with Indigenous peoples. So I'm glad to lead us into and to see all of us go into this next conference to really talk about the how do we implement FPIC, because we know it needs to be implemented all the time.
Thank you, Kate. And you've also reinforced what we're going towards in our next conference, the how do you make this work? How do Indigenous values and corporate values work together for a better future? For those of you watching, you would have heard a very good overview of the discussions that we had at our last conference. You can tell that as an organization, ours and also Kate Finn's and First Peoples Worldwide do not shy away from the tough questions. These are things that are deeply impactful to our companies, but deeply impactful for us and our Indigenous communities. Going forward, and you heard Scott mention this, partner or perish. You can tell this is my academic side coming out on the publish or perish, but partnership and perish is the future. It is where we are going for companies, like you heard from Kate, in terms of permits being revoked because companies had not gone far enough to seek Indigenous consent on projects. It is the future. So what I want to turn now to the last half of our discussion here is some of the questions. I appreciate that some of you sent questions in. I'm going to share those with our panelists to answer. And if you're watching, please, again, slido.com. The passcode is FNMPC to send your questions in. I'm going to start with the second question that's come in there, at least on my screen, which is what are some of the ways that companies can better engage with the community if the community has little capacity due to competing priorities? Before I pitch that, I'm going to actually ask JP to start with this one. I would like to, as a member of a community, point out as well that it's not always communities who have competing priorities. We often have companies coming into our areas who give us competing priorities that they have in the negotiations. So just to frame that up a bit, it's not just the Indigenous side. But JP, I'm going to let you answer this one.
Thanks, Mark. Canada has made this turn, given, the 215, given Truth and Reconciliation. Not only resource companies and project-based companies are coming to our communities for our attention, but we have companies from all sectors coming to look for the attention of Indigenous communities and people. So when you come to a community, you have to understand the community circumstances, which is inclusive of the question that you're asking around capacity. If the community doesn't have the capacity, you've got to help support the community in developing that capacity. And sometimes that's actually allocating both human and financial capacity to the community to utilize to engage your company. You got to be very clear in the what's in it for the community, but the communities also want to know, because we've been around long enough. We want to know what's in it for you too. If this is going to be a partnership, that we've got to be able to understand both value sets. And before anything, and if we kind of back up, let's have a conversation about values. I mean, everything that we talked about, not everything, but a significant part of the last conference was around the intersection of values. Where are your values as an organization? Understanding the values of the community that you're engaging in. Because if you can't align on the values, it doesn't matter what you do going forward. It's going to be very difficult to get anything done. And having those honest conversations with community about what your intent is. And of course, many of us always say the Creator gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. Listen twice as much as you speak when you're engaging the communities and not going in with a hard agenda. Those are some of the basics, I think, when you're going into community. And then also, just lastly, understanding that you're often going to be sitting down with multiple communities, particularly around linear projects, and understanding the breadth of capacity amongst individual communities, and creating space for communities to share in resources, share in ideas, to support each other as well. So I hope that helps, Mark.
Thank you, JP. So just moving along here, I'd like to raise another question that's come in here. And Kate, I'm going to direct this to you. You did host a phenomenal panel at the conference on Indigenous women in sustainable finance, which was one of the most highly rated sessions of the entire 2 days. And again, a reminder, this is all available online if you access it through FNMPC's website for the recorded session. But the question that's come in here is, how do we get more Indigenous women into business finance career paths? And how do we inspire and support girls and communities to feel confident going into this space?
I think we are at a moment where we recognize, and I'm so glad to be at a moment where we recognize the strength of leadership that women have and can provide. And it's really, I say this often, but it's always true. It's the honor of my life to lead First Peoples Worldwide as the third Indigenous woman to lead the organization. I never thought I would have the opportunity to say that. And I think in terms of providing support, oftentimes there are these traditional so-called bottlenecks that really keep people out of corporate boards. Having a particular resume, having a particular experience. And the thing is there are Indigenous women everywhere that have those experiences. Leading a tribe, being the CEO of a tribe, CEO of Indian Health Services, being the leader of a tribal enterprise, those are experiences that are directly transferable to private corporate boards. And so it's a recognition, I think, on the private sector side that those experiences are transferable. That, in fact, if you want to talk about accountability, fiduciary duty, accountability to community, accountability to shareholders, tribal leaders do that every single day. And there are so many of those skills that are completely transferable. And I think that all of us together, as we work together to provide mentorship within our own organizations to build up Indigenous women in their chosen careers. There's so many Indigenous women now who are engineers. Their first Native woman in space is in space right this second. The transferable skills are out there, and it's just a matter of removing bottlenecks, removing challenges that led to only a particular person on boards in the past, recognizing the transferable experiences, and then creating a mentorship opportunities that really lead people to be able to voice their expertise in the private sector.
Thank you, Kate. You touched on something, and it's reference to one of our other questions here about transferable skills, the leadership that our people have in either leading organizations, leading tribal governments, leading organizations, and that skill set is very transferable to corporations and corporate sectors. And I know, JP, I just asked you a question, but this leads in very nicely to the question about how do you get more Indigenous people on boards? It's up there on the screen. They tend to demand they need CEO or C-level experience. How do companies recruit and retain Indigenous people into these corporate leadership positions if they come in it with the idea that the candidate must have been a CEO at any one time?
Yeah, the C-suite experience. A lot of our leaders may not have that C-suite experience, but when you start to stack up their experience, they certainly do. And what I was trying to get at a little bit earlier in my opening remarks, Mark, was the idea that when we think of a lot of these corporations are having to intersect with our communities. I mean, any corporation that is going to be dealing with land issues, you need to have you need to be having Indigenous people in your evergreen list, which means the people that are ready for appointments to your board, and start developing that list. Because what's happening is that when we think about the shareholders of Indigenous people, that these development corporations that represent a lot of First Nations, their shareholders are their community members that have, this is back to the values and the importance of having Indigenous oversight. And I'm going to bring it right around, I promise. In making sure that, the way that our people think about the land and our shareholders, it's 7 generations, whereas the regular corporates or shareholders that, put their money into the pot, they're looking for every quarter. They got to recite maybe, annual, but I mean, they're reporting every quarter versus every generation. And that's the importance, and I want to reiterate that, of having Indigenous people on your board of directors. So, a fundamental, opportunities to do that. A conversation I had with Keith Martell, Sherry Brandt, I think, Mark, you were part of the conversations as well, is making sure that you've got targets we went through a process making sure that we have 30% of women on corporate boards. Well, why are we not setting those same targets? Because if we don't measure, if we don't set these targets, we're never going to achieve the numbers that we require. And having these lists, and there are some really great Indigenous directors out there. There also is a great Indigenous firm that actually has the pulse of Indigenous people at the director level readiness that can be leading those lists into corporations, because there's plenty of us that are there, and you've just got to get brave and start pointing us to your boards. And there's just no other way to do it. We need to see ourselves in these places to drive more of these relationships that we're talking about. So we just got to set those targets, and we got to start hitting them. This 0.42% and this 0.1% is simply not good anymore.
Thank you. It's encouraging to see that companies are starting to address this. They understand that there is a need for better diversity in their board and their governance and their leadership, and diversity results in better decisions, not just for Indigenous people, but for companies, for outcomes, for returns. So you'll be hearing more of this from the Coalition and First Peoples Worldwide going forward. You will certainly hear more about this at the next conference in April next year, where we will be raising this again. I wanted to address a question now to Scott, and it's about how one measures social impact on a project. This also relates to capacity of a project and how can nations better engage. So as it's noted here, impact in communities can be qualitative, and it makes it hard to track. How can companies track and report on impact in a way that the finance sector understands?
Thank you, Mark, for that question. And I'm going to approach the question about how do we do this in terms of trying to answer it. And in Canada, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released some calls to action. And for businesses, call to action 92 speaks to adopting the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a framework for reconciliation. So it, of course, contains the standard of free, prior, informed consent, but there are a number of other articles in the declaration that I would argue apply and can be used to measure social impact. So how does the project increase Indigenous self-determination and self-governance? How does it protect key environmental values that are critical to the exercise of Indigenous rights? How does it advance economic reconciliation with Indigenous peoples? And I think in Canada, we haven't spent enough time speaking about what it truly means to, from corporate Canada's perspective, to adopt and implement the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a framework for moving forward. So I'm very much looking forward to further discussion on this issue. That brings us back to the issue of capacity, which is the second point that I'd like to talk to folks about. Of course, and Mark, I liked how you reframed the question, because the capacity issue is not just on the Indigenous side, it's also on the project proponent side. And oftentimes, I sit at a number of these tables across Canada, corporate Canada and project proponents lack the capacity to meaningfully engage with Indigenous people in the way that we've been talking about this morning. Of course, one way that we can address that is through additional representation on boards and in the C-suite. But really, I think a number of companies in Canada are having to rethink how they engage with Indigenous people and move outside of this consultation and accommodation box that emerged in the early 2000s towards one of partnership and understanding what that means. And I really liked JP's comment about listening twice as much as we speak. One of the major pitfalls that we normally see with project proponents is they come into Indigenous communities with pre-baked ideas and preconceived notions about how things are going to go. And in fact, the BCAFN Yukon regional chief spoke about getting away from conversations about how to get to yes initially with Indigenous peoples and talking about building relationships and partnerships. The last thing that I'll say on the issue of capacity is there's a real role for organizations like First Nations Major Projects Coalition to play in terms of helping Indigenous communities increase their capacity and ability to engage in relation to major projects. This is something that many of us work on a daily basis, but for some Indigenous communities, in particular smaller communities, it may be their first encounter or second encounter with a major project. So drawing on some of the First Nation-led resources that are available are critical from my perspective in terms of bridging that capacity gap. And then I'd like to just touch on a third point here, and this is a point that Kate made. Indigenous leadership is already happening in the business sector, and Indigenous values are already being taken into account and applied in companies and economic development entities across Canada. And I want to tie this back to something that JP mentioned, which is our Indigenous economic development entities, which already have community representation on their boards. And the purpose and the raison d'etre of that is a number of reasons, including ensuring that the community's Indigenous values are considered in all of the key decisions that their economic development entities are making. And so there are already a lot of, I think, really great success stories that we can build upon as we start to deal with non-Indigenous corporate entities across Canada. And there's a lot of lessons that I think that can be learned again, that Indigenous leadership is showing and present. So thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Scott. In terms of that Indigenous leadership that's already being shown, I'd like to point out that last year's conference at the Major Projects Coalition, what we did was on ESG, and that report is online on our website. But we asked the questions about how does an ESG rating agency, how does an ESG-based investor find certainty in their investment dealing with Indigenous people, and on what you'd mentioned there, Scott, in terms of the capacity on the ground. And what they told us was that, well, at least some of the investment private capital firms in Canada said, if they could see an Indigenous equity investment in the project, that would give the gold standard for them to know that the project has been accepted, there has been consultation, and there has been consent granted by the Indigenous party in that investment, and they could approve that ESG investment. That is something that we highly stressed in that report. Again, it's online, fnmpc.ca under Resources tab. But the question going forward is, from these companies, was how do you replicate this going forward? How do you ensure that future investments show up? How do the rating agencies actually see this as a standard across the board for Indigenous communities? That is a large discussion that's going on right now in the formation of the standards under the new frameworks coming. The ISSB, which is based in Frankfurt and in Montreal, is asking those questions. And we as an organization, on behalf of our nearly 100 members across the country, are vitally interested, are fundamentally interested in how that comes forward. So the standard right now that would apply for the gold standard, equity, ownership, a vested interest in the project. And then beyond that, it would be unique to each community. But we will be discussing this at our next conference in April 2023, 24th and 25th here in Vancouver, and we invite you to come. There is one other question I just want to touch on quickly that's on there because we are running out of time, was the question about equity for communities. How do communities find the capital if they haven't got it to make equity investments in green energy projects? I would like to point out that there is a group in Canada called Indigenous Energy Canada, it's Indigenous Clean Energy, ICE. Google it, take a look at there. There's over 200 different examples across the country of Indigenous parties who are now equity owners in various projects, and they run the gambit from transmission to generation to distribution. Every community has had to find their own path. The other place I would also invite you to look again is back at fnmpc.ca/resources, is the Capital Access Papers. We've started to put this question out there for our members, and you'll find some information there as well. There is not one answer. It is unique to each situation, but now we have a convergence of the interest from willing Indigenous parties, willing energy proponents, and willing financial houses. So please take a look there. Before we move on, For the rest of your day, because we are out of time, I want to give each member of our panel just 1 minute to highlight what they'd like to say to our viewers who would be considering coming to the next conference from MNPC, which will be on the 24th and 25th of next year. I'll start with you, Kate.
Thanks so much, Mark. It really is such an honor to host this conference with you, to be part of this conference. And I just want to remark on something that Scott said about organizations that are building capacity and being the intermediaries, but intermediaries simply because it takes all of us to work together to create this ecosystem. There was a question that I saw about venture capital and about finance. Well, let's all work on this together because, as you said, Mark, every community is different. Every First Nation, every tribe, every Alaska Native community will have a different path to what it means to participate in net zero. But there is a values there. There is a values core there that gets carried through. And so many of us, First Peoples Worldwide, First Nations Major Project Coalition, Native Women Lead here in the US, Awista Corporation here in the US, and so many others are working together to make sure that those values are the values that come through in the deal making. So I just am so excited to see how this ecosystem of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous values really can come through. It's already changing the private sector in so many good ways, like you said, creating a competitive advantage for Indigenous peoples for what I think is some of the first time in history, but also really creating economic options, economic well-being. And I just want to center us here as we move forward in this discussion about values. Economy for Indigenous peoples is so many things, and it does mean financial returns and economic development, and it means well-being. And so I'm so excited to point and to discuss with all of you at this next conference how values can be threaded through everything that we do in finance, business, law, engineering, architecture, in every sector, in every way, to point towards Indigenous well-being.
Thank you. And now we turn to Scott.
Yeah, so I'm looking forward very much to seeing everybody at the conference in April. And I think there's a couple of key themes that have emerged in our panel discussion today. So I'd really like to unpack with people what it means to achieve equity ownership. We've seen a number of deals across Canada, and they vary quite significantly. So although, Mark, I think the gold standard is definitely equity, Indigenous equity ownership of major projects, we want to make sure that that equity is being achieved in a way that maximizes benefits to Indigenous communities. And I think we'll see there are some best practices emerging from the transactions that have been publicly announced. Not surprisingly, for those of you that know me, the second theme I hope we get to unpack together is the reemergence of Indigenous legal orders and how they will inform an Indigenous values-driven economy. And the third thing, I just want to come back to a point that Kate made, which is Indigenous economies. And of course, Indigenous economies moving forward are going to involve equity participation in major projects, but they also involve a sacred relationship with the environment and the ecosystems that we all live in. And that means ensuring striking a proper balance between resource development and ensuring healthy fish and wildlife populations. And that's a balance that we haven't yet struck. And we need to ensure that major projects are also built in a way that sustain and enhance biodiversity because of the significant impacts to our ecosystem. So I'll leave it there. Looking forward to seeing everybody again in April, and I'm sure there'll be some very interesting conversations.
Thank you, Scott. And to JP.
Those are brilliant answers, you two. You know, it gets down to three things: caring, believing, and doing. We're coming around the table because we all care. We're believing that we can get this stuff done now because we're seeing it in every sector, from fisheries to traditional energy to energy transition projects. And it's about doing more of that and learning the lessons and actually applying those lessons that we've been talking about to future projects and actually building more capacity, making sure that we find balance between our economies and our environment. If I can share, one personal story, when I think about my own community, our ecosystem is intact. I drink the water out of the lake, I fish, I hunt. Anybody that knows me, if I'm not working, that's where you'll see me. But then we have a sawmill, and we also have amazing advisors. My community and two others work with the FNMPC as members to support our communities in mining development and lithium and the whole energy transition process. And I want to throw out there that this is just the beginning, because now when we get actually into tertiary products such as batteries, the facilities that are going to manufacture these batteries, as an example, they're going to be owned in partnership and building that capacity and business know-how by Indigenous people. And we should be leveraging that. Canada has a responsibility to its Indigenous peoples. We need to make sure that we're actually driving more of a circular economy, more values down the chain to make sure that Indigenous communities have the ability to manufacture said products. Because the last thing we're going to want to do is the same thing with the pandemic. We're the last on the list to get our own shots. We don't want to be in that position again as nations trying to use batteries for our EVs, etc. And Indigenous communities are going to play a vital role in all of that. So this is just the start. There's way more to come. We're just hitting our stride.
Thank you, JP. You're right. This is just the start. So thank you to all of you, and thank you to people watching today. We invite you to the conference, which will be held in Vancouver on April 24th and 25th, 2023, and it will be on the values-driven economy. More information can be found at the website fnmpc.ca. So thank you to all of you for participating today and for those of you watching, and we'll see you in April.